Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us this evening. This is the Aspen City Council work session for June 7th, 2022. Before we get into our agenda, I just wanted to take a moment. Normally I'd save this for regular meetings, but this past weekend, this community lost one of its leaders in both thought, action, government, you name it, Bob Broadus. So I just wanted to take a moment at this table while we're all together, just for a moment of silence, recognition of losing Bob Broadus this weekend.
Rest in peace.
Thank you for that very much.
He's gone physically, but he's still around.
He made a tremendous impact on our community.
No question about it.
Tonight's work session has just a few items on it. Number one is the moratorium update, short-term rentals tax considerations. Then we do have extended time for council board reports and council updates or discussion. And I believe we also have one other item that we will need to discuss this evening regarding bike rental fleets in the right-of-way. But let's get started with our first item, which is short-term rental tax considerations. And I just wanted to remind council that, we are talking about a discussion around moving towards a ballot question. So not necessarily decisions to be made here at the council table, but more maybe a range of options and alternatives, as we've all discussed, going out to some polling as well. So tonight's discussion is really just to frame up the information that we're receiving back. Pete Strecker is here to introduce the item.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you.
Council members, if I may share my screen.
Please.
Thank you. Let's try this one. That looks good. So, thanks for having me back. It's been such a long time since we spoke last about short-term rentals. Tonight, I wanted to just do a couple of recap items on kind of our last couple of discussion sessions, and then see if I can guide you through some information to see if we can help kind of hone in on what a appropriate tax question might be, and then be able to take that to do some polling and gauge that direction with the community and what might be palatable. So as we spoke at the last short-term rentals tax question, we talked about three main areas, those being timing, a tax versus a fee, and then kind of what the resources from either the tax or the fee would be used for. At that last meeting, we talked about the aspect that the targeted time frame would be a November date for a potential tax question to the voters. And we talked about the aspect that polling would be preferred to kind of, again, get that direction from the voters and to make sure we're on the right track. In terms of taxes versus fees, we've had a number of conversations, including those with ComDev on the fee ordinance of late. We have heard from council that we want to keep those two items really distinct and separate, that the fee is going to be related to the operational costs, whereas the tax will be a lot more around the impact side of things. And tonight's discussion will kind of continue that theme. The other item that I really heard at the last meeting was that we wanted to make sure there was a strong nexus between what that tax would be and how it would be used and how it was kind of determined to set that rate. At the prior meeting, we talked about the aspect of the differential between a commercial assessment rate and a residential assessment rate, and what the delta would really be in a property tax. In looking at that, we basically determined that to generate the equivalent amount of revenue from the lost property tax revenue because of determining these as rental properties versus commercial properties, we would have to set an excise tax rate of about 5.4%. And so at that meeting, we kind of showed where that 5.4% would fall in relation to what other community members are doing currently on their short-term rentals, and basically shows that we're kind of near the bottom third, I guess, if you will, and the big outlier being Ouray right now in that spectrum. At the first reading of the ordinance, the new ordinance, there was a discussion around affordable housing mitigation. And at first, there was a discussion about making that a fee. We heard from the council that it would be preferable to do this through a taxing process. The top row really kind of defined the aspect on that analysis at that time. It was about 2.48 bedrooms per unit that was kind of being used for that calculation. We did a little bit more scrutiny on kind of what establishments would be considered kind of lodge exempt, and we kind of put those there. That's not necessarily all inclusive, or excuse me, all encompassing, but it's probably the majority of those that would for sure meet that definition. And you can see there's about 400 bedrooms, and they have about an average of 1.8 bedrooms per unit, excuse me. And then we were able to kind of back into what would be the classic versus the owner occupied, or at least made an assumption about 75% of those remaining units would be classic versus 25% would be about owner occupied.
Is that based on what we see today, or just sort of where is that coming from?
The 75-25 split, yeah, it's really quite honestly a bit of a wag, but I do think it's going to be in the ballpark.
Okay.
So until we really go through the permitting process, we won't have an absolute on that. But basically taking that one step further now with that little bit of extra scrutiny around that data, we kind of determined that at a target of 100% affordable housing mitigation, we would be looking at trying to generate $12 million in tax revenue, which under the prior analysis of about every 1% is $862, I think, $1,000. We need about a 14.5% tax rate to generate that. To target the 65% mitigation rate, we would need about a 7.7% tax, and to get to the 30%, it'd be about 4.2%. Again, this is just to get to the equivalent amount of an excise tax to generate that much revenue.
And that's outside of the kind of additional potential tax that we've talked about to equate between commercial and residential. That's just as
Yes,
a
that would
standalone.
be excluding that other tax that we've already discussed.
And Pete, when you are shooting towards that, I think $12 million number with the 100%, is that recovering in 1 year, the mitigation? Or would that be the mitigation over, say, a 10-year period?
I believe it's actually over a 30-year period. but
Over a
yes,
30-year period?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
One other clarification, we talked about the sort of three buckets, right? The lodge exempt, the C, and then the owner occupied. And so are we talking about this as equally applying to all of those, or are we excluding, because we had talked before about possibly excluding lodge exempt from certain things because they pay in other ways. So can you clarify that for me?
Yeah, so this calculation determines that we would be trying to recoup what the classic and the owner occupied would need to generate. But in terms of a taxing structure, the tax would be applied universally across all of the short-term rentals.
It would be.
Yeah.
Okay. And so we're not, I guess what I'm trying to make sure is that we're applying it evenly and we're not sort of excluding one group from the math, and so the two other segments pick up the burden for that excluded group.
Quite honestly, it's a little bit of the reverse. It would be we're excluding them from the basis of determining the amount we need to capture, but everybody shares in paying into it.
Got it. So the number, if we included those, would be higher, but we're not including them because they capture that in other places, and then we're evenly distributing it because it's a tax, and so that's how the nexus needs to be applied. Okay.
So, Pete, the few hotels, like the Jerome Hotel, for example, they would be totally excluded. They're not in the short-term rental pool at all.
Correct. That is a correct statement.
Okay, so all of the, I think most, if not all, of the units that are in the Alps and the Gantt and all the ones that you listed on the previous page, those are all taxed at a residential property tax level.
They are, that is correct.
Rachel and then Skippy? Thanks.
Yeah, I'm trying to find the article. I can't see it right now, but it was about Breckenridge's ongoing discussions on STRs. And the one thing that struck me was they were getting rid of the term exempt, like lodge exempt or exempt from a tax. And very similar reasons that we are, but they were using a term more like resort accommodations, that these things have traditionally been resort accommodations. They were designed as resort accommodations, and instead of calling it exempt, they seem to think that that created problems over time. So I don't know if we want to take note of that and think about that as we go forward, but it just did, it made a lot of sense, and it seems like they've had a little more time with it, and so the term exemption was bothering them, as opposed to saying, you know, hey, this was designed for resort accommodations, resort accommodation, it is taxed differently. Thank you.
To that point, can you just play a reminder for me? So where are we capturing that value or mitigation on affordable housing on the lodge exempt group so as to not need to include that in this equation? Can you refresh my memory?
Yeah, so in terms of who pays the tax, it is not the lodge exempt entity. It is the tourist that stays at the lodge exempt property. So in all cases, we're having the tourist pay this affordable housing mitigation fee.
Right.
Excuse me, tax.
But we're saying there's this sort of complicated equation that allows us to approximate the overall impact on the employment landscape. And so as a result of that impact, we need to house those individuals that are a result of that impact. And we're saying we're going to count them for these two groups, but why are we saying we're not counting it for the third group?
Correct me if I'm wrong, Philip, but they have already paid, if you're a lodge zoned property, you've already paid that mitigation?
That's what I want to confirm, that I understand properly.
When we were speaking with EPS on how to structure the study 4 months ago, we had extensive discussion about the relationship between short-term rental, classic, and owner-occupied, and their presence in a residential unit as being fundamentally different from a affordable housing job generation and mitigation standpoint than something that's in a lodge property, which is a commercial building. And in terms of our existing regulations for extracting affordable housing in response to job generation from different use types in the community, the consultants felt like it was necessary and appropriate to treat the commercial lodging properties differently from residential properties, which in this case are functioning as short-term rentals in some capacity within the community.
But is that because, as Pete was just alluding to, as part of the process of being developed, they have paid those fees in some other way? Or is it because the proximity to the core, the density of the units are as such that the impact per unit is simply less, and we're accounting for that in a sort of roundabout way?
It's yes and.
Yes and.
So it's primarily about job generation from commercial versus residential, and how in the past our studies have arrived at those numbers, and there are assumptions baked into job generation per square foot or per unit from a lodge property based upon its proximity to services in town, based upon occupancy rates, based upon the sort of intensity of the development activity in the operations and maintenance of that property over time as being different from a residential property. So to put it another way, the residential property is generating, by our past studies, generating fewer jobs per square foot than a commercial property is seen to have produced. And so in the context of this study, the consultants felt, again, that it was appropriate to account for that larger job generation at the front end, at the beginning of the project for commercial and lodge properties, and to treat that differently compared to these residential properties, which are had lower generation rates to begin with.
Okay, and so these, I recognize that they're probably, developments over 50 years that had differences between them, but properties that were developed as condo hotels in the commercial core, in the lodging zone district, paid some form of affordable housing mitigation that a residential property never had to pay at the time of development.
I can support the first half of the sentence. Whether a residential property had to pay it or not, I don't know.
Got it.
But
Okay.
when a commercial lodge is built after 1975 in this town, they were mitigating for affordable housing in some way.
Got it. And those condo hotels counted in that way.
Correct.
Thank you.
Yeah. Just to kind of remind me or clarify for me, if we were at the 65% rate that you have there, that is kind of across the board with other mitigation for a project that was coming in new would be a 65% mitigation? Yeah, you might as well stay up there.
world that I'm
Hopefully
not.
I didn't get any exercise today.
Getting the steps in.
I have no doubt that Pete can't wait to have his work extricated from mine so that he doesn't have to deal with
Right,
this
right,
stuff.
right.
So the consultants, when they produced the study that you reviewed for the first reading packet, they were looking for somewhere to pin some numbers.
Sure.
And 65% is the mitigation assessed for new commercial square footage and new lodge square footage. 30% is the mitigation required for new residential, single-family, and multifamily redevelopment. And so those were numbers that already had some justification in past studies. And the consultants said this in the first reading meeting. I will reiterate because I can hear Rachel, our consultant, telling me to. Council is free to pick a mitigation number somewhere between 0 and 100 as it sees fit. These are simply for sort of instructional purposes, informational purposes, to give you a sense. And they're, again, based upon existing mitigation requirements elsewhere in the land use code for similar activities.
Yeah, no, thank you for going very detailed on the answer, but I was thinking that at the 65%, as we are discussing it and looking for what fits in the jaws of public acceptance and what's appropriate, there's a parallel with the commercial mitigation rate. And so I would kind of lean towards the 65%. We're not making other entities do the 100% of every employee at this time. So that would make more sense to me.
Just to sort of respond to the last
Please.
part of that statement, we do require presently 100% mitigation for new residential square footage under the current code. And the direction we've received from
Right.
council to this point is to continue to require that 100% mitigation for jobs generated on new residential construction.
And we're looking at that new residential construction mitigation amount, though, being an amount appropriate for a residence
That's
as
correct.
opposed to appropriate for a commercial lodging rental use.
That's correct.
And so this would make up the difference between those two
That's correct.
elements.
We treat those differently now, and the proposal under the moratorium ordinance is to continue to treat those differently.
Okay, thank you.
Don't go away, Philip.
Really, what's he
What's happening over there that's so exciting?
I'm still,
Wordle.
Oh,
I'm still confused. Before the first reading, I made an inquiry with you about 100% versus 30% on residential. Commercial is 65%, residential is 30%, but you're saying the code now is 100% mitigation for residential. And I'm confused where those numbers are differing.
The 30% and 100% on the residential side are for different types of activities. So the 100% is if you have a house and you're adding 100 square feet onto that house, you're required to mitigate for 100% of that new square footage. The 30% number is if you have a empty piece of property and you'll want to build a multifamily development there. 30% of the units on of that development would have to be affordable housing. And so that is a 30% inclusionary rate or a 30% affordable housing mitigation rate. And we use the numbers differently in different circumstances. And if you want me to go into more detail, it's only going to sort of get more complicated and further derail the discussion.
I just want some kind of anchor, so I have some understanding. So it's 100% workforce housing mitigation on residential redevelopment, or
New residential construction.
new residential.
New residential square footage, yes.
And it is the mitigation rate as if it is a residential structure, not going to be used for short-term rentals at all.
That is correct. The
If they
current,
start using it for short-term rentals, then the excise tax starts to kick in and collect the mitigation fee, potentially.
We'll see, yeah.
if it's adopted, and yes, there's caveats, but yes, the idea here is you have a new residential building, right? And it has mitigated at a certain rate of a certain job generation rate that's tied to it being a residence.
Right, for a real family.
If there is an excise tax placed upon the operation of short-term rentals, and that property has a short-term rental permit, to the extent that it operates as a short-term rental and pays that tax, then that additional affordable housing requirement is being met by the remittance of that tax. That's the sort of structure here.
Collects that tax from the client. That's,
Correct.
Not from the owner.
thank you.
And so you say every condo hotel that was developed after 1975 has paid workforce housing mitigation?
Well,
But the
No,
Guyana-
no, what he said,
1976,
no, but what he said was not across the board equally distributed. There have been different,
codes changed significantly over time.
But
the
yet-
requirements have been different.
But the point I'm trying to make is, in 1975, North Enel, the Gant, Aspen Square, the Alps were already developed. So to exclude them, does that make sense?
Honestly, I'm just responding to the direction from the consultants who suggested that we would start to get closer to the perception of a double dip on the affordable housing requirements for these lodge properties if we were to treat them the same as residential properties.
But we're not double dipping if they never paid workforce housing mitigation, if they were developed prior to 1975.
The concern is that the studies, the way that they're structured, do not allow us to make a distinction from one property to the next. It's either a commercial lodge property and is treated a certain way, or it's a residential property and its job generation is different.
So we're just giving an exemption to every condo hotel regardless of when it was developed.
Well, and to be clear, it's just lowering the amount of tax revenue we're really generating, because we've just excluded those units from this calculation as the basis for determining what tax rate we want to apply. So if we added those lodge exempt units in, it would bring that 12 million up to, I don't know, 15 million, and then it's a higher tax rate. So again, if, as Philip said, you can pick from 0 to 100, I guess all we're doing is lowering the 100% target.
So EPS,
And just to sort of expand on what Pete said, a short-term rental occupant who's staying in the Gant or staying in my house is paying the tax no matter what.
Yep.
So we would be recouping that affordable housing mitigation money no matter where you're staying. But what this table is showing is that those properties were exempted from the job generation study, not being subject to the tax or not.
yeah, I understand that, but there are also some classic STRs that were developed prior to 1975 and haven't paid workforce housing mitigation either, but they are being included in this.
Mm-hmm.
You just got to draw the line somewhere, I guess.
That's correct.
Skippy?
I just, just to comment on that, Ward, for sake of discussion, I think it's a really good point, and it deserves its airtime. And I understand what you're getting at, right? That they have not previously mitigated, and so are we carving them out unfairly? I would say the sort of countervalence, other than just we have to set a line somewhere to think about, is, they're 50-year-old buildings. We're already seeing some of the Aspen Alps be redeveloped. And I would imagine the other ones of these buildings in the next, 2 decades probably will too. And so just like with residential, before we just kind of would let you go, and now we're saying, well, if you come in for demolition, now you have to mitigate for previous square footage. That may be the way to capture that at that time. And the other piece that I think about, at least, is if they were built pre-1970, they were sort of built in an environment where affordable housing wasn't needed because it was all naturally occurring. And so is it really fair to sort of retroactively ask for that money back in a new universe that they also couldn't have planned for?
From a commercial standpoint, buildings that did not pay workforce housing mitigation, the example is always the Butcher Block building.
Yeah.
And that a previous council phased in mitigation depending on how soon you would redevelop it. So that if it goes out 10 or 15 years and the Butcher Block building gets torn down, they get no credit for workforce housing mitigation. So there have been various approaches taken.
Rachel?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. This is just for consideration, but, I'm wondering if an issue like this can be dealt with in the actual ballot language, that it would put down who it applies to, which is the residential STRs, and then you could say, and lodging properties that have not paid affordable housing mitigation in the past. And so it's just a thought, but it could be, it would require a little research, whether the Gantt did pay or not, or the Alps did or not, or whatever, those pre-1975s. Some, like the Alps, have actually put in units afterwards, whether they were required to or not. But I just don't know, that would be a legal question as to whether it's something that would be able to be applicable to, clearly these residential STRs that we're trying to equalize the mitigation with, and then have rental properties that have not paid affordable housing mitigation in the past. It's just,
Yep, it's a suggestion.
Yeah.
I'm,
well, what I'm looking at is the more that are potentially in the fold, the lower the rate you could ask might be. But I just want to put it out there.
I would like to focus on the short-term residential.
Only,
Yeah,
okay.
Just keep it clean.
yeah, I mean, looking back 50 years and stuff, I wouldn't even want to go there. I want to deal with kind of the impacts that we're seeing from the properties that are far-flung and in our residential neighborhoods primarily. That's where I'd like to,
No, yeah, I appreciate that. It's instructive for me to think through all these details and nuances, and hopefully for everyone else too. But I agree. I think keeping it simple makes sense.
It
Simple as
gets
this gets.
confusing for me with the 5.4%. I understand that that's the difference between property taxes for commercial and residential, but I just don't understand how that fits into this puzzle.
it's coming.
Would you like to?
So, yeah, we're really treating that as distinct from the affordable housing mitigation kind of analysis that we've just showed you. So we've basically demonstrated two different ways to include a nexus and how to address where to set the tax. The fact that we're running commercial businesses out of a residential unit and not charging them a commercial rate for their property tax is one issue that this council has brought up that we researched, which generated the 5.4%. And we have a couple of slides in here to say, well, what would be the good uses for that 5.4%? Because currently our property tax goes to a handful of funds, and those are the ones that are basically not receiving revenue because of these properties not being addressed at a commercial rate. And then we're talking about this affordable housing as, again, layering on top of that to say, okay, if you put both of those things together, the affordable housing and this other property tax kind of equalizer, where would you land? And so in terms of this particular slide, you can see that we show basically all four scenarios. Just the 5.4 that we've talked about to date, plus these layering on these other options of 35, 65, or 100% mitigation. And so, you know, you can see that if you look at the two middle bars, we're kind of in the realm of what the spectrum looks like on a number of different sister communities. I did add a few other communities based on what the council had asked for at the last meeting. And you can kind of see then if we did the high end, at the 100%, we'd probably be, you know, a bit outside of that kind of realm. So I believe, Mr. Mayor, you did ask me about what did some of these other communities use their tax revenue for?
Hang on to that.
Yes, sir.
Before we go there. Ward, does that bring you closer to,
Well, I think we're conflating the impacts of short-term rentals and property taxes. I mean, there are very few hotbeds that are actually in hotels in town, I think. I mean, Hotel Jerome and I don't know what the other hotels are that are paying a commercial rate. But I think most of the hotbeds are paying a residential property tax. And I'm not convinced that this is a way to try to address a property tax delta.
you're saying that the majority of our tourist accommodations are taxed as residential because of places like the Gant and such?
Yes.
Do we
Other
have,
big properties like the Limelight, like the W, those will all be paying commercial.
so
property tax.
do we have a breakdown or a number of units that reside in those two buckets that he's talking about?
I don't remember the exact number, but there's close to parity between the number of lodging, like traditional lodging units in town, lodging beds, and short-term rental beds. Short-term rental units. How that translates into beds, I don't know that we've gotten into that level of detail. But there's close to parity.
And Rachel, you're the one that's brought this up in the past. Perhaps you can straighten me out on how these are conflated and what the justification for having a 5.4% on STRs for the delta between commercial and residential property taxes.
Yeah, thank you. You know, I would be the first to say, similar to the other question at the table, it's up to the board as to whether it wants to do a full 5.4 or 4.75, and do you get up to close to 100% of equalizing or less? But so that should be clear, just like the other decisions. I think there's just a really big fundamental difference between paying the commercial property tax rate, which all of our retailers do, and many of our lodges do, or hotels, to be able to offset the impacts, to repave the roads, to do everything else. Short-term rentals are paying a residential property tax that's 3 times less. That is that is getting a commercial level of use, and we know most STRs are going to be drive-to and park STRs, using the streets more. They're not necessarily on the bus lines. And there's an inequity of the small lodge, a Chalet Liesel, paying a commercial property tax rate and having to pass it along to each one of her guests, and the short-term rental right across the street gets charged, you know, what's it, 50%, 60% less property tax? You know, commercial property tax is 3 times higher than residential. So it's setting up that you are residential, you get to pay less, and it's an unfair competitive advantage to the actual lodges. It also is shortchanging our community on the impacts. You know, we're supposed to make it up somewhere else, and I don't know where we do. That, you know, pardon me, I have a frog in my throat today. Ribbit. I mean, I've been trying to think a little bit about, you know, how would council react, as we should, if the state actually passed some legislation to start to equalize this itself, but the state doesn't seem like it's going to do that anytime soon. And, you know, so I see it's just a totally unfair playing field that we are now saying we're legitimizing 1,000 new beds to compete with the places that are paying a commercial property tax. And of course, you can charge less to stay in your STR. You don't have to pay the same tax burden. And so there's just an inherent unfairness. And beyond that, you know, especially for these not owner-occupied or not classics, you're talking about second home ownership or out-of-state ownership. They're not paying Colorado income taxes either. So, you know, we're just making this a big free ride to say, here, make your money here, buy residential property in Aspen, and you can make it into a commercial business, and you can pay residential property tax rate. And this is to try to say, you can make that investment if you'd like, but you will pay the rate as an ongoing business concern, because that's what you are.
Okay, so let me just pause here for a minute. I understand the disparity between commercial and residential, and the commercial isn't paying an equal share for the things the property tax pays for. So if they're skating on, if their guests are skating on it, why not charge a 5.4% excise tax on hotel rooms that are paying the commercial to recoup what they're not paying?
Well, because the commercials are paying commercial rate. It's the residentials who aren't paying.
Well, the commercial rate,
They're paying a commercial property tax rate at the
That's
Limelight
lower.
Hotel. No, it's higher. Commercial property tax is 3 times higher than residential property tax.
okay, so,
Correct?
That is correct.
That's correct.
okay.
So this is why I'm saying it's just not an equal playing field, and it would be encouraging more people to make STRs, because you will be able to run a business at a residential property tax rate.
Okay, so this 5.4% is, if that's just part of it, that just makes up for what the commercial isn't paying, okay?
Is paying. It brings them
Brings
up
them
to
to
what the
parity.
commercial is paying.
Okay.
Yes, so it's equalizing it.
Thank you for
Okay.
Yeah.
for remediary training on taxes.
No, it's all a challenge for all of us.
And I'd just like to add on to Rachel's comments, and that's precisely why we're where we are now.
Yeah.
Is because people are buying properties specifically to rent them as STRs.
They are a business concern.
Exactly.
Which brings us back to this slide,
Yes.
and it's got a graduation here on the slide. 5.4 is that property tax delta. And then the next 3 scenarios, referring back to the slide that we just saw, are at 35, 65, or 100%. And again, this is done by an outside source to give us some insight into our situation. We have flexibility here. The discussion that we're having tonight is to talk about a range, perhaps. We're talking about going to a poll. This has to go to the voters. This question is not going to be decided at this table. It will go to the voters. Tonight's work session is to hone in on council's feeling about a range and about the information that we're getting back here. I can already hear, Ward had some legitimate questions about, not necessarily methodology, but about the fish tank that we're exploring here. And Ward, you're absolutely right. This is not perfect. There is no perfect in this, but this is as good of a simulation of the information that we can get to give us a snapshot about how we can approach these impacts.
Yeah, and I'm so happy that we're going for the taxes instead of fees for the mitigation, because there were some freaked out people. We got some emails.
Including some of us. We're like,
Well,
Yeah,
it freaks us out because we see the magnitude of the impact, too.
right?
yeah,
We
and
should.
so just the sales and lodging tax that our guests are paying is what percentage now? It's close to 20? Sales and
So
med-
we have a 2.4% city sales tax, and we have a 2% lodging tax across any type of lodging accommodation right now.
Then there's a county and state.
Yeah, if you layer those other things on top, you're gonna get to 11.2%, I believe.
Okay, so
that's on the
11.2%
That's
is.
including state, county,
That's-
RAFTA.
Okay, so when
And the lodging.
somebody buys somebody pays for lodging, they're paying 11.2% on top of that, and we're looking at this to add this on top of that 11.2%.
Correct. And in this scenario that you see on the screen right now, this does not include their state, their local, other taxes. This is talking about their accommodations aspects.
Yeah, so
So-
if we're gonna add a 9%, that gets up to 20.2% that they're paying on
Right.
taxes.
And for an example to that, I think Ouray is at 29% roughly. I think it's
So
roughly.
these are just their lodging taxes?
This
that
is
were
just their
comparisons?
lodging. This
These
is
are
just
not
their
total
short-term
sales
rental.
Apples to
tax.
apples.
In our research, communities that have instituted short-term rental taxes, it has been a layered-on tax. So whatever the pre-existing tax structure was for lodging accommodations in that community, the short-term rental tax has been placed on top of that, which I think to the point you're making, Councilmember, starts to be a larger number than what would normally expect, than one would normally expect to say as a sales tax rate in a retail operation in town, for example. These are different tax structures.
Just one clarifying question, because we had 30 in the previous slide. This one should be 30?
I think it's 35. Did I get the percentage wrong?
It's 30, 65,
Sorry.
and
Okay.
100.
So that
I
should.
just want to, just want to make sure.
Yep. No, that's a typo on my part.
Okay. Are we ready to like have a little
No,
discussion?
we're not.
No? Okay.
Not yet.
Hold tight.
Let's go through the rest of the slides.
So there was a question about what do these other communities use their taxing for? And so we talked all about the Colorado municipalities in the past and the fact that they basically apply these towards affordable housing. I think Ouray was the only one that had wastewater management as an additional component. Looking at these other few that I just added, in Hawaii, they have greater than 50% of their tax from, they call it a tourist accommodations tax. More than 50% of that goes to their general fund. They have a little less than an eighth going to transit and about an eighth each to tourism promotion and some local jurisdiction share. Monterey County really focused more on the tourism side for their tax revenue. It went to arts and culture programs, economic and agricultural development, things of that nature. And Mammoth Lakes uses about 60% to its general fund to really handle things like infrastructure maintenance and also recreational opportunities. So there's a little bit of diversity between some of those other ones I've added versus kind of the Colorado-specific organizations.
And my assumption would be if it's going to the general fund, that's probably allocated that way because they're probably using it for some of the infrastructure or things that are denoted in others.
Certainly in the case of Mammoth Lakes, it's definitely for a lot of infrastructure-related maintenance. I think Hawaii probably be similar, but I don't know their full taxing
Yep,
structure.
understood.
General fund always helps support your police.
Understood,
Things
yeah.
like that.
All right.
So kind of building on that and kind of looking more locally at what would be the needs of the tax from our side. Obviously, we've talked about the fact about affordable housing mitigation. This council has certainly identified some very forward-thinking on new development and new units and how to get those. The lumberyard being one of the biggest ones out there and having a price tag of nearly $400 million. On the graph you can see there, that is our current major revenue stream for development or acquisition of affordable housing, and it is quite volatile. Obviously, we're on a high point right now, but that doesn't mean we won't be always there. And so in terms of use for a new tax or new revenue, it would certainly be good to be able to add to this bucket, provide us at least some level of base funding that we could potentially pledge as a resource to then use for debt issuance and bring those units on. And then we had the term community infrastructure brought up, I think, at the last meeting. And what I've done for you here on the blue side of this slide is to really show you where the current property tax is going, which is really, we have two different property taxes, one dedicated to stormwater. And we've spoken in the past about that program and how it's a high community benefit, but it might be a bit underfunded and needs some resources to be able to accomplish what's kind of on the horizon. And then we have the general purpose property tax, which currently in the budget, we have kind of split it at 65% to the general fund and 55 and 45 to the general fund, and then to the capital fund, which is the AMP fund, to handle some of our infrastructure. And so with a hypothetical allocation in the green, it's really saying that 5.4% delta that we're currently not capturing out of the property tax for these units that are really operating as a commercial space in a residential unit, and the fact that we could potentially generate 4.4 million, how would you potentially allocate that out? I don't need to say that those percentages are hard in any way, shape, or form. I think the council has purview to either set those if
Add
they'd
up to
like to.
110.
There's always that problem. Who does the math around here? But it gives you a sense of maybe some of the opportunity to spread those dollars out and kind of put them into some places for use. In terms of the general fund, we have a lot of competing departments right now. That goes from the police department to Phillips and my organizations, the attorney's office, the council budget, and the recreation center. These are very different and diverse set of businesses that are all being funded out of the general fund. So when we layer in additional needs into that particular bucket, the available dollar starts to squeeze some of the other funds potentially, and especially if we bring in some big wants or needs. Looking at the race to zero as a council objective, I think there's going to be some dollars associated with that. And so in terms of a need, I think there's one that's sitting out there that could potentially use some tax dollars. On the AMP side, which is the capital side, that again funds our same departments that I talked about. So Phillips, when he needs a printer, or say finance. But it also funds things like the bridge work that we need done, the roundabout, and some even larger projects like the entrance to Aspen, if it comes to be, the replacement of some of the mall improvements on the pedestrian malls, and some community wants like the armory that was recently discussed with the council. So, the fund right now, its only source of revenue is essentially this general property tax at 45% of that total collection in any given year, which is 3.8 million. That 3.8 million is not going as far as it used to with current capital construction inflation. And then layering on some of these desires for the community really is going to be quite a challenge. It's going to delay some projects or have some real difficult choices that have to be made. So in terms of need, there's another bucket. And then we spoke about stormwater. And as this council knows, in 2022's budget, we took action based on some direction and reduced some of the operational costs in the stormwater program and shifted those back to the general fund and to parks. Thank you very much. So we alleviated a little bit of pressure, which created a little bit more revenue for this fund to do some capital work. But you can see that the total operational cost, which is below the dotted line, is at least 50% of the total amount, and we only have 800,000 basically to do capital in any given year. And as of a couple of years ago, we had $20 million worth of projects to do from this fund. So we have not inflated this with this recent inflation bout, and I think this number will be a little bit further north at this point. So in terms of need, again, just trying to outline where the resources could be utilized. So with that, we received direction that we would like to do some polling, and maybe we would be able to have that occur during the month of July. But we need to work with the consultant to create the correct questions and maybe put some parameters around that. So I guess a little bit of clarity might be nice in terms of these three bullets. Are we on the right track for where this tax needs to be applied? What are the uses? I think to the extent we can be more specific, it helps with the polling, it helps with the question development. I think at the end of that statement, you can always say, and others. But I think we really want to give the voters some real direction on where these funds would predominantly be used. I need a little bit of help in terms of maybe a range of different levels of tax that we might want to pull for and see where the community wants to land. And I guess that's it.
Thank you. All right, so we're talking about two things, tax rate and uses. And I think let's go in reverse. Let's talk about these uses that were just shared with us. And I can break those down. I guess stormwater, capital infrastructure, and I'm going to leave it as general fund, although you could break that out even more into environmental and various specifics, but I'm just going to leave it there for now. So let's, council comments on that. Let's talk about uses, and, you know, generalities or specifics is just fine. We are just moving this forward for polling and talking to our community. So, John?
Yeah, I just want to start by saying,
Pull your mic down in front of you a little bit, if you would.
thank you. Just want to start by saying that, in my mind, the environment is the community. They're interchangeable. And so any dollars that go towards the environment are actually going towards our community.
Bless.
So I personally would like to see definitely part of this fund go towards what's Pete's put under the environmental umbrella. But I do agree that some should go to housing and infrastructure. That this all makes perfect sense to me. But again, voting for the environment is also part of, to me, it's part of infrastructure as well.
Thanks. Skippy, comments on uses?
On uses, so for me, the affordable housing is the most important piece to this. You know, I continue to believe that there is no community of character without the characters who live in it. There will be nobody here to solve for our environmental problems unless they are here. And though people will point out that we can do whatever we want around STRs, and those units will, in almost no cases, be refilled by longtime workers. That's precisely why we need the nexus, so that we can replace it elsewhere, because it is inexorably lost. So for me, the first piece is that affordable housing piece. I think the 65% is the right target. I think it creates that parity. There is some emerging data from Acroland that number might be higher than we once thought it needed to be, but I think we'll get there when we get there. So I'm referencing, they had like a study of workers, and 50% of people saying that they actually prefer to live down valley, right? And we used to say that number was higher. Even if that's the case, we're at 38% and falling, and we need to make up that deficit, and we can make that correction later once we've done that. So I would put that and hammer it into stone and plate it on a gold brick. That 65% would be the goal, but I do want to test what the community's there for. I also believe that 5.4% is appropriate for all the reasons Rachel said. And then where does that get allocated? I think John makes some really good points about the environmental impacts. I think Rachel has made some great points, and staff has driven those home with the data about general community infrastructure needs. And so the question, so I feel like I'm fairly agnostic within that range. And then the question that follows for me is, well, if it's in the general fund, then we're giving future decision makers the most flexibility to allocate that as necessary across those needs. And so logically, that makes the most sense to me. What I don't know, and what I'd love to know and follow up and maybe in the polling, is how do general fund questions fare in elections versus specific ones? Because it...
All right.
I'm answering the question directly.
I would say that your comments are great, but they'd probably be more valuable at a time where we start talking about survey questions, polling, that kind of thing.
Aren't we giving feedback on what to pursue in polling?
Not quite yet.
Okay. All right. Well, then I will.
Not quite yet.
Okay.
Not to the level of specificity that you're getting into.
Then the question I would have for us as discussion, rather than for Pete to go do polling on, is how do we balance the I would say, desired flexibility of the funds versus how well they will be accepted by the voters and how well they do in terms of public debate. That's the question that remains for me that I want to discuss. And the last thing I just want to say for all of us, and also just sort of for the community, is this is really challenging. This is a wicked problem. This is a situation of truly competing influences or needs that are both good. You know, I've talked a lot about how I think STRs are the last vestige of affordable lodging. We're talking about making a huge negative impact on that community benefit. We're talking about a $100 a night room going to $125 and, you know, $400 going to $500. Those are real changes that will further negatively impact the tourists of tomorrow. And I thought long and hard about that. Because the tourist of today is the citizen of tomorrow. But ultimately, where I came down is we've got to prioritize the citizen of today versus the citizen of tomorrow. And we have to have hope that those people that we actually do house here in the environment we want, we have to trust in them to rise to that challenge if they feel that that lodging affordability is best. So this is not easy, but I think on balance it's the right choice.
Rachel?
Great. I just want to be clear, because for me, the 5.4% is going towards housing. And, you know, that's what's the calculation behind it, of this is not the same mitigation as housing. So I already see 5.4 going towards housing myself. What is the balance? You know, I'm there with John in a lot of ways, because of what I see. You know, I know that water and water quality is very important to our public. It consistently polls high in both city and county polls. And I think stormwater, taking care of that and not dumping our pollutants into the river, is probably going to be a very real need and a high need. And, you know, last thing I want to see is Highway 82 collapse over there by City Market, where that pipe is failing, and there's a bunch of other ones as well. And given the climate change scenarios that are evolving around the country, being able to really deal with mass flooding is going to be an important element when you have those torrential downpours. So the stormwater infrastructure is very important to me. I tend to think that there are a lot of things we're working on and we're going to be doing in response to the climate change prerogative and others, but I'm not so sure that a term like electrification and enhancing our electric green energy production, it may be something that, if it's that simple, a simple phrase, enhancing Aspen's green energy production. But if we start getting into terms where people think we're too far ahead of the public, it might not be there. So I'd be nervous about that. But I do think the environmental things are very sound. And you know, we're still trying to launch a larger composting program to save the life of the landfill, and, you know, a number of those sort of things. So I do believe that in general, voters want some specificity. And so if you were putting it into the general fund, some portion, you could allocate it towards specific purposes within the general fund, such as the ARC and recreation, or towards police and policing capacity. I mean, I think that if you had some specificity, it's probably better than none. But that's just my take on it. And a final thing to really bear in mind, Pete, is that I think at this point, coming from the EOTC meeting, the county and the city open space are going to be doing some polling to find out about people's interest in the Maroon Creek, the intercept lot connections to the airport business center and back and forth. And then separately, our open space and trails is looking at polling questions for their renewal on the sales tax this fall. And so we have to find a way to kind of keep these a little separate, or people don't get too confused by the different polls that are going out there. And so it's one last thing, I'll break Tori's little rule there, but for me, I think the poll needs to be at some level about giving information as much as asking for information back. You know, we have to be explaining both the nexuses that are behind these numbers, or the impact that's behind the numbers, and then you ask a question. But it'd be like asking me about Italian language. I know nothing about it, amore, and that's it. I wouldn't be giving you much of a solid answer. And so I think we have to think very carefully about how it's structured that way, to be both informative and honest and straightforward about what really is at stake for us and what our purposes are. Thank you.
Rachel, can I clarify one thing you
Yeah.
said? You said the 5.4% was based on housing, and my understanding, so correct me if I'm wrong, is that the other number, the one that has the range, is based on this employee generation impact, and the 5.4 was based on creating parity with the commercial rate.
With the mitigation of the commercial rate, I thought, but no, I maybe I have it wrong, but I'm trying to look at, are there allocations based on the property tax component and the other component, of just a plain excise tax. But, Skippy, I have to tell you, I don't know how much goes to housing in my mind, but I do look forward to the fact that we have a real estate transfer tax, we have a housing daycare tax. I'd like to see a little more of that going towards daycare perhaps. But I also would like to see the county start participating in funding housing. And the more we take on for all of ourselves only, and perhaps ignore other city resident needs, which are for safe streets and stormwater and these other things, I want to make sure it's somewhat broadly split to things that we don't have a dedicated funding source for now, whereas we have some sources for housing, even though I'd like more too. Okay.
And then I'll come back to you on the rate and your take on that
sure.
stuff. Ward?
Yeah, I visualize the 5.4% as a deficit to the general fund. So what I'd like to see, I agree with Skippy that I think that we should be going to the 65%, which equates out to 13.1%. So 5.4 general fund, 7.7 for other funds is how I can, in my mind. But just to take 5.4% and drop it into a general fund budget, I think maybe a higher level of specificity of where that 5.4% goes and what happens with the remaining 7.7% that we're looking at for mitigation. I agree with everything that's been said here, with John saying that the environment is the community, so some of that 7.7 and actually some of the 5.4 that goes into the general fund that funds some of these environmental programs can go directly to the community. And I firmly believe that the biggest impact is on workforce housing. So of that 7.7, I want to see a good portion of that going to workforce housing to offset exactly what this tax is to do, the impact of STRs on our workforce. And I'm not going to get away from this without addressing this to Allison, that there was a accurate study for employees and employers, and I want the city council to have access to that study, please. I wanted to add data points and a more thorough understanding of how different sectors view what is needed. And that consider this a formal request for that.
Yeah, agreed.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm supportive of 13.1%, which includes a 5.4 to bring equity towards deficit and general fund streams.
So you're talking about rate, you talked about usage. What we've heard on uses, there is support for environmental, there is support for capital infrastructure, there is stormwater. And I'd almost, I wish we could rename, it's not just about stormwater, it's about water. I wish we could rename that because I don't think people understand what we're talking about when we use that and then housing.
Well, river health.
You know, it could be anything, but, and I don't know if that's, I'm not just talking about this, I'm talking about it overall. The way that we categorize that, I think, is just misleading. But anyway, so is that enough information for you on uses to start dialing in on those?
So I'm comfortable with affordable housing, environment, and if you don't want to have any greater specificity, or if you want to say environment including clean rivers or river health,
Failing infrastructure.
yep, whatever we want to, if you want to have any sort of kind of bullets underneath that, I'm happy to broaden that term just to give the polled voters
Well, you just said just environment, but,
infrastructure.
yeah, so where does that really, what we were talking about earlier was the term general fund. So where are you parsing that out?
Well, so what I'm saying is I hear Councilmember Menzero's question about how well does something pull if it's to the general fund, because it sounds like it has broad uses, right? So I think in the ballot language, if we said it's for X, Y, and Z, which may fall in the general fund, may fall in the stormwater fund, it may fall in childcare fund. It's just a question of how specific do we want to make the use of the taxes so that we can generate the right level of support that you're looking for and the appropriate application of those resources. If you want it to be more broad, it can be more broad.
Okay. We're starting to mix the uses conversation with a survey strategy or polling or ballot language, what you just said. I think we're getting, we're moving a little too fast right now. So once again, your answer to me is yes, you have a narrow enough scope of uses, but when we go to the next level of this, playing them out for language or specificity is our next conversation on this.
If you'd like another conversation before July to set polling questions, yes. If you'd like to make that determination now and we establish those polling questions for July,
Yeah.
I'd look for more
Well,
specificity.
hang on a second. We'll try.
Okay.
We'll try. I don't know that this room is equipped at this time to get there. Polling is a science. Ballot language is an art. And I'm not sure that we have the equipment right now, but we'll try.
Mayor, just
Diane.
one comment, thank you. I think, and I think this is some of what Pete was saying is, and you pointed out well, there's the, what does council prefer? What does the polling look like, and what does the ballot language look like? The more we can get all of that to align completely, and right, clarity matters here, and you all have identified that it's absolutely correct. If you go out with a ballot question that says, would you like to put this in the general fund, it's not a winner. And you all have already specified, right, affordable housing, environment, and I think, Mayor, you were asking earlier about, I think it is important to say environment, parentheses, carbon reduction, and river health, or whatever those pieces you want it to be. Specifying those right now is hugely helpful to Pete, and as he said, we can come back with another discussion of those questions. But understand, whatever you tell us tonight is what it's gonna be a straight line moving forward. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry, can I jump in for a second?
Skippy was up.
Well, I was just going to ask you to clarify. Now I have a question for Diane also, but when you're saying we're moving too fast, I don't know what you're talking about. Can you help me understand what you're hoping to accomplish or not accomplish and why?
Because we need to get there by process. Again, this conversation is a lot of detail to try to move quickly to a polling that is in a month or something. This board, as a 5-member board, is not, I don't think, totally equipped at this time we might get there. It's gonna take us a little longer tonight, apparently, but, we might get there. I just want us, we just need to go in a process here so that we can get to the result that we need without getting bogged down for the next 3 hours discussing how we label stuff. We need to see it back in iteration probably, but we'll see.
Okay.
We'll see.
I appreciate that we don't want to be here for 3 hours. I still don't really understand what you're saying, but I guess I'll just try and say what I think the question is, which is, what do we want to know? I don't need to have another.
I was just gonna say,
Yeah,
I get the larger buckets of affordable housing, environment, infrastructure, or community infrastructure, if we want to use that term. I guess what I'm looking for is, are there certain key items underneath any of those buckets that we would already be able to delineate? Because I don't think the council needs to write the ballot question. They'll need to be presented the ballot questions that, for consideration.
Right.
So we don't need to wordsmith everything.
Right.
I think I need to know if there's more specificity under those buckets that we can kind of drive enough forward so that we can generate the right questions for consideration.
I understand.
Yeah. I am not sure what the Open Space and Trails group are considering asking. Are they thinking about asking about finishing the park that goes outside here or not? And I'm not sure if they're going to be asking, redoing the malls and things like that as part of their questions. So I don't want to have this question overlap that question if those are those purposes. But I also feel at times, if you have a polling list of 8 or 9 projects, you'll find which ones fall to the bottom pretty quick in terms of public support, which ones rise to the top. So, as long as you're spending the money to do the polling, it seems like having some specificity and trying to gauge the public's interest in allocating dollars towards those purposes makes sense. But I do understand, and I'm not trying to wordsmith, but I was trying to write down the type of things I was thinking, failing infrastructure affecting water quality and storm runoff and flooding, that type of bullet point. And I'm also thinking of when the county did its polling and we had kind of sentences that literally became part of the ballot later. But we were able to see increasing green energy production and reducing Aspen greenhouse gas emissions. I'm just trying to
Yeah.
figure that out.
And so what's interesting is what you just said a second ago was projects versus purposes.
Right.
Yes.
And so this is what I was saying about going too fast.
I would like purposes.
Because purposes is where we need to sit,
100%.
not projects. And so what I was saying before was like, slow down for a second, because before we all start saying like very specific, it's
Projects.
purposes.
Yeah.
It's purposes.
100%.
So
Okay,
Yeah,
okay,
I'm on that page.
okay.
if I can just finish these last two
If
and
you
I'll shut
want,
up.
if you want to share
Yeah.
two more
Two more.
purposes.
Well, I was going to say, addressing affordable housing shortfalls created by new demand from short-term lodging. And then the last, I would think of something as like general fund support for. And so then you could put your specific projects, policing, recreation support, blah, blah. 3, 1 or 2 things there, or for the composting initiative. But, you could say general fund support for and be able to capture it within a bucket so it's not everything the general fund does.
Thank you. Ward and then John.
Yeah, I think what we're looking for is a why and a what. Or why do we need this, and where does the money go? And I don't know if we need to bifurcate this. I think other communities have had 2 separate ballot issues. One would be a tax, another excise tax, a sales excise tax. If we just include it as a 13.1, which makes sense to me, and just divide it all up. In the 5 of us are not going to be doing the polling, nor are we going to be doing the ballot language. But as I understand it, the ballot language, and I think it should be as specific as possible, because I don't want 13.1% tax just going into the general fund. I want to, when we come to a ballot language, to say what it is. 8% is going to be directly associated with the environment, and 5% or 5.1 is going to be workforce housing or what, but I assume that during the polling, we can parse out, or we can get from the community what they feel the needs are, and use that to help educate and inform what the percentages of the tax that we're going to ask to be put on a ballot issue are.
Hopefully.
Hopefully. It'll let us know, and if it's a different read, then you say maybe you're not ready for November, and you go to the next March, if it needs more refinement.
Yeah, so I don't know if I'm just rephrasing what you're saying, but why we need it and where will the money go?
Yeah, the purposes.
Okay,
The only thing I'd say is let's go 13% even and not a 0.1. I think it's hard to explain the 0.1.
John, your comments, and then we need to get onto that next as a topic, because I think we're pretty close to uses. With Skippy, Skippy wanted to add a couple things perhaps, but John?
Oh, that's kind of where I was thinking about going as far as specifics about, my thoughts were some money should probably go to not only fire mitigation, but also to forest recovery once we have the fire that we're going to have, as Valerie McDonald has pointed out to us. It will not only affect our water quality, but it will affect our water delivery system.
It's true.
Skippy?
Interesting thought.
Yep. I'm hoping next time we see you, we've got the results of polling and we're discussing potential ballot questions. As has been said, I mean, for me, we're really answering two questions, right? What number is the community willing to accept on an overall STR tax? And for what things are they willing to accept it for? And the buckets I've heard are affordable housing first, environmental concerns, and community infrastructure. I think the specifics that have been said here, I don't have any problem with testing any of those, and there's probably pluses and minuses to those details. I'll let that be for the poller to figure out. And I think that the way the polling came back on the Wheeler was really helpful in that we first gave people the question blind, right? Because a lot of voters, no matter how much is in the newspaper, are simply not going to know anything before they show up in the ballot box. So we need to understand that baseline. And then, as Rachel said, then do some education, see how that affects where people are, right? And so knowing the initial preset or reaction to those buckets versus the post-education, I think will be really instructive. And I think that is all I will need to see.
Okay, so then that brings us to, in view of polling, of a survey, if you will, a couple of council members have already said tonight that, oh, I see this 13.1 and the 65% as a good target. But when you're doing polling and asking, do we want to ask for a range? Are we looking at an upper and a lower? Is this council saying that we would like to just poll and ask the question, do you accept this? And I'll wait for Rachel so she's in on this. No problem. Rachel, so we are just now talking again about the rate. So the uses, we've got enough information around that to figure out how to tease it out and make it the right amount of purpose-based uses. Now we're talking about the rate, and several council members tonight have already said some initial support around that 13.1. And the question here is about a range. You know, we're going to be polling, we're going to be asking our community. So is this council saying, hey, we all feel like this is the rate that we want to put forward in our polling? Or do we want to open this up with a range or ask our community what their feeling is on that? So that could be, you know, for example, we at this table right now, I don't think anybody is really suggesting that the 5.4 tax delta only is necessarily what we support. But should we be asking that of the community? I also don't think that, I heard support here for a 19.9%, sorry to giggle, 100% affordable housing mitigation. So do we want to take that out of our polling questions for our community as those two end ranges? Should we be asking our community between this, I'll just, as examples, should we be asking the 15% that URA comes in with, down to the 9.6, which is kind of the low end of what, so anyway, that's my question, is that now that we're talking about this, I've heard from you what your preference is, and I'll say that I kind of agree, but for purposes of our polling, where do you sit with our approach to share with me?
I don't want to be the pollster. I don't want to tell them exactly what to ask. I think what we can pass along is that, we roughly feel that 13%, 13.1% is a good target, and we want to test the validity of that with the public. So I would ask them to formulate how to bring back information, and maybe the public says less, maybe they say more, maybe they say dead on.
Okay. Ward?
Yeah, I want to make it absolutely clear in the polling that this is a tax that is going to be paid for by tourists. It's not going to be paid for by local users. And then to frame it in 13%.
It could be a local user if.
Well, it could be, but it's,
It's paid by the guest. It's paid by the person buying the service.
yeah, so that the people that are being polled know that it's not a general tax. It's not recouping 100% through a fee that would make it prohibitively expensive for somebody to get an STR license. So make absolutely clear who's going to be paying this tax, and then that what the impacts of the STRs are and what the needs in the community are, and target a 13%. I don't know how the pollsters work, but that's what I'd like to wind up with, but let's see how the pollsters handle it. I'm not familiar with this.
Okay.
Same here in terms of having to ask the pollsters how they want to see it, but part of a dollar or denomination or a rate, to me, needs to equate to what you can get done with it over a given period of time. And so if we were to ask lower numbers to say, for 13, I'm going 13 straight, I don't like the 0.1. Right. 13 will, for these things, will advance us. If we want to dial that back to 7.5%, we can drop these things, won't happen. Or something like that. I just don't know how you let the public know this will get you this and that will only get you that.
Yeah.
And is there a way that the pollsters can ask that appropriately? And kind of similar to what Ward was saying, and as I kind of said before, the education and the explanation behind this is going to be very important. But even the 5.4, people need to know that would only accomplish the mitigation of these properties over a 30-year period. That it's not going to, we're not asking for 5.4, the whole ball of wax, to do it in 1 year. This would be an extended time frame to accomplish enough.
With what you've already heard, I don't even need to go to John yet, because with what you've already heard on that rate and what council is saying, maybe this is a better question for polling individuals or some feedback from polling individuals. You know where we stand on it.
Yeah.
But is that?
I do think you're making the poller's responsibility a little bit great. I think the aspect that he has to decide what an upper bound is to ask the public is asking him to do something or her something that
The upper bound's 100. We're not going to go over that, right?
Well, so are we going to start at 20% as a max to a polling question down to 0?
I think we should think about a couple of different ones that we can give him, and whether it's a 20% below 13, and a round number and something like that. But I do think it'd be very important for the pollster to be able to say, The rate in Maui is 20%. The rate in this place is 15%. The rate in this place is 12%. Because if it's not in the context of other premier resort communities, it's going to sound like we're making an incredible grab for a high percentage. But when you compare it to what other communities are doing with STRs, we're right in there. And so I think that has to be part of how this is presented to the public.
So I wholeheartedly agree with you, except for the aspect if we're trying to pull what we think the average voter is going to do when they walk to the polling station and they don't have that education.
Well, no, that's why I'm
probably not
saying
getting
it
an
needs to
accurate-
be part of the question that they ask, the pollsters have to ask to say, you know, among peer communities such as, they have a rate of X and Y and Z. Aspen City Council is preparing to ask a question this November. Would you be comfortable with these rates for these? I mean, they format it, but it has to be put out there that we're not the lone community among resorts charging a tax on their STRs.
Right.
Okay, thank you. Diane?
I've worked with this polling company on 2 polls so far, and how Rachel described it is probably how we would do it. And Pete, to your point, it is like there will be education that needs to happen during the election process that tells people what exists out there. And it would be very normal for this to be a, city council is considering a tax of this. Given that these communities have this and here's the other end, do you think that number is too high, too low,
Okay.
et cetera?
So you think that you've heard enough from this discussion to frame this up, or do you want to hear specifics from us about here's a top end and here's a bottom end, or what would you like?
I think
here.
I think just knowing this pollster, that I think we have heard enough on the number, and we can always, right, we can always figure out how to sneak into a work session if we need to. So if we get stuck there as we're starting to work on it. But I think given this question, it will probably be framed. And if you've taken any of them, right, they typically include more, they're closed-ended questions, except for like, the attempt is to be mostly closed-ended questions. So things like, yes, I think this is good, it should be more, it should be less. Sometimes there'll be a why.
Okay.
Thank you.
Skippy?
Diane, I agree with everything that you just said about how we sort of put that forward, but I just want to be clear, reiterate that point, sort of like we did with the arts, having a blind question and then an education, and then what is the delta is important, because even if we spend $100 grand on an election, which we ain't going to do, a lot of people are going to show up in the polls having no idea any of that background and have not read it. So we also need to know what people will do coming in blind.
Some of it will go to also how the ballot question is written.
For sure, yeah.
John, any further comments?
Nothing to add. All of my illustrious colleagues seem to have covered pretty much everything. Thanks.
Pete, do you have enough from us to move forward on this?
We will move it forward and determine if we do need an additional circle back with the council, or if we can bring things together from here.
You know, I can speak for this council. We are always happy to see you. We are always happy to talk about these items, and we love to be in the loop as things move forward.
Thank you.
So whatever can return to us, we're happy to see it. For the record, I do want to say I expressed my reluctance about the polling the last meeting we had about this. I want to share that again. Like I said, it's a blend of art and science, and I don't know that it worked last time for us, but maybe this time is going to be better and different.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All good, Diane?
Thanks, Pete.
Great. All right. Thank you for being here for that portion, and thank you for just jumping in when you needed to jump in. I appreciate you. My pleasure. Yeah. And you might be sticking around for a couple more minutes or not. I don't know. I'll be here. Okay.
Philip is also covering P and Z. That's why he's got one ear.
I'm very amazed. 2 public meetings at once. It's like those contacts, one far and one close.
All right, so now we need to have a quick conversation about bike rental fleets. At our recent meeting, council members, we talked about the right-of-way usage, what we were going to allow, what we weren't going to allow. We peeled back a bunch of the COVID provisions that we had in place. One area that this council was willing to continue to support was for bike shops to have their rental fleets potentially rent a parking space and use that right-of-way for bike rentals. Again, we were specific in saying that we were not looking for retailing or even repair to be going on, but this is really for bike rental fleets. And Trish is here because she needs some specificity on this one. We need some clarity about maybe
How much space and where?
dimensions as well as rates and charging. And so she's got some information for us, and then we'll make quick decisions.
As far as dimensions, this is right. If council, that's why, okay. If council would like staff to utilize the dimensions of, like, whether it's safe, because we can get down a rabbit hole with dimensions as far as head in, whether it's a bus lane, whether it's, you know, close to an alley, whether there's an adjacent business, but if we go under the guidelines of, let's make it safe for not only the rental fleet itself and the people that are going to be in that space, but also the traveling public, meaning, you know, the vehicles driving by, and also, you know, the pedestrians. So we have come up with guidelines on, depending on where the area is, like to make it safe, including protection for the area itself. So that it needs to be, you know, a barrier protection as far as planters that are filled with soil that protect the area. Then we can go forward with those guidelines developed based on safety and, you know, uses in the public, and then what's equitable for adjacent businesses, that kind of thing. So if council's willing to, you know, have staff go, you know, proceed with, you know, those guidelines, we can go ahead and do that. As far as pricing, like what should be charged in these spaces, we do have rates to compare to. So I'm going to go through the various rates that we have, that we charge for parking spaces and for mall leases and for using sidewalk spaces, all those rates, okay? And so in order to compare them, these rates they're in different units in our code, but to make it clear to council, we have boiled them down to a straight, flat rate as you would relate it to a parking spot. So we understand that these rates are based on square footage, not necessarily a parking spot, but so that it's easily relatable for council, so per parking spot, all right?
Okay.
These are the rates. I'm going to go from high to low. So we have what we charge for a construction parking space, that's $100 per day. Then if you're going to park in the core, that's $40 per day. Now, granted, you're not allowed to park all day in the core because we limit parking to 4 hours, but let's assume it's an all-day rate, so we're going to say $40. The next is the mall lease rate. So what we charge for restaurants to use the mall, that comes out to $26.22
A day.
a day. And then the last one is retail encroachment fee. So this is that space between, you know, the sidewalk and the front of curb, you know, that area. We charge $14.67 for that, you know, space along the sidewalks. So those are the 4 current rates that we have on the books that could be related to bike rental.
If you could, how many locations are looking to rent spaces? How, 4, 10,
We've been in touch with, I believe,
3?
I believe 3 are interested.
Okay. Thank you. I mean, I seem to recall that Mitch had some number before of how much a parking space might generate over the course of a summer with a 85% usage, or 15% vacancy, or something like that. And I don't think that those rates would work for a retail business in town, frankly. But I really just wanted to make the point of that's how much we're deciding to not put into our transportation fund when it happens. And I don't know if we make that up through our general fund, or because these people will be paying sales tax, that goes in the general fund, we can reimburse the transportation fund. It's a small item, but, you know, I know we're tight on transportation dollars, too. I don't think, I could see much more than going for the, something between restaurant and retail encroachments on a, you know, 90-day summer. That starts to be a pretty significant amount. What were you thinking?
Let me just kick it off. So number one question was about the safety barricaded. So the answer is yes, right? We need some sort of perimeter safety barricade. Planter boxes were used last year. We're still in favor of that.
Question on that. I think we paid for that stuff during COVID, but we would not pay for it now?
We paid for it for the first year of COVID. The second year, the individual businesses were responsible for it.
Paid for it. Did they still use our boxes that, like, or did they?
Those boxes are out at the golf course, so go out
But would
golfing
they
and you'll see those.
use our stuff but pay to use them? Is that?
No, they've been
They've been
repurposed
repurposed?
at the golf
Oh,
course.
they're being used somewhere else. They'd have to source their own barriers
Yes.
at this point. Got it.
Well, it's important. I mean, you can't have people looking at a bike and adjusting the seat and then having a car run into them. you
Yeah,
know?
no, I was just wondering, I was just thinking of what that might cost in addition to this. Yeah.
Okay. Ward?
Yeah, first of all, have we all decided that this is right-of-way usage for a parking space is going to be allowed for, I think, two bike shops? I'm thinking that the one where Butcher Block is has a lot of sidewalk space and may not be using a right-of-way on the street. But the maximum number would be what Basalt Bike and Sport, Hub, and Aspen Bicycling. So maximum of 3 businesses that we're going to make an exception.
It could be 4.
Yep.
It could be
Who's the
4.
fourth? Who's the
Haven't
fourth?
had any reach out.
There's a couple of,
New businesses could
the
open.
ski shop last year had some, I don't know if they've filled out their, I don't know, I'm just saying like just 3, it could be 4.
Well, 2 to 4, let's just put it that way. Do we all agree? I have a problem with making an exception, although it's for something that we feel is the right direction to go. I still have a problem with making an exception for a special class of business. I want to hear affirmation for support for this from the council before I really get into pricing.
I am supportive. I could go on about why if you want to hear my whys, but.
I know what the whys are, right? And I agree with the whys. I'm just want to know how everybody feels about it.
I support it. I think the more people we can get on bikes and out of their cars, the better.
I also support it as a carve-out, and if we want to extend it further, I support that too.
You know, I raised this last year or last summer when we were going into this, and, you know, I'd use the expression, you know, here they're renting a space that doesn't really have enough space for the type of business they want to run. And so therefore, they want public space to be able to do it. But I would have to also balance that by saying that the retail environment in Aspen has been to subdivide and subdivide, make those spaces smaller and smaller. I don't know that you could run a bike shop totally on your interior retail space anymore. And, you know, there's always been a little bit of private space, like at the hub, where they could put it up on that little deck. But, you know, it strikes me as awkward because I know that then you have spots like down at the Mill Street Plaza where they don't need to rent a space, and, you know, so maybe it'll be a little less expensive for them, but, you know, that's why I think we do need to charge a fee. I don't think we could make it free. But I acquiesce to the reality of the difficulty of town and to wanting to have more biking, so.
Okay, pulse is taken.
Yeah.
So there were two numbers for parking spaces, $100 and $40. $40 is the maximum income from a parking space through parking fees, although a person can't park there. But assuming that they're all hours of the day, income was coming from that parking space, it'd be $40. Mm-hmm. And what was $100 for a parking space?
Construction.
Okay. And the sidewalk space was $14.67.
Correct.
So, for example, Basalt Bike and Sport is using sidewalk space. They would pay $14.67 for that and a different rate for a parking space.
If we choose.
Yeah, I think that we should at least have the sidewalk space in somewhere between, I guess, at least a $40 a day, the lost revenue for parking. We're losing a number of parking spaces for the living lab for pedestrian and bicycle safety already for a couple block area, 3 block area. So I'm sensitive to the number of parking spaces being vacated for the living lab. And I'd like to know how many parking spaces we're talking about. We're talking about 4, how many we're talking about. There'd be some kind of data point for what we should charge, but I think we should certainly charge at least $40 a day for the parking space and the $14.67 for sidewalk.
All right, let's start, let's just use that as a start for this conversation and see if we can get agreement there. The suggestion is for a parking space, 1
Per space.
First base.
per business.
No, let's say Basalt Bike and Sport needs 3.
No,
They need 1.
no, I'm just saying, I'm not gonna open this up to say to somebody, do you want 3
No,
at $40 a day?
For purposes of discussion, I thought you were asking.
I'm saying, yeah, are we starting 1 space?
1 space per business?
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay. And $40 a day is your suggested right now?
$40 a day minimum, I think, yes.
Yeah. Other input?
Yeah, I support $40 a day. If we want 1, that's fine. If they want 3, that's fine for me. I view it as a net positive for the community to have bike rental and support local business over parking, but that's just me.
I hear you.
I agree with Ward's statement about the lost parking spaces, though, so I'm going to stick with 1 space per business.
At 40,
yeah.
is something that you can start the conversation with?
Exactly.
Rachel, your thoughts here?
Yeah, I would think about going a little lower than the 40, but, you know, and I'm trying to think, it's at least a 9-day, maybe 120-day season from this point. At $40 a day on a 90-day season, that would be $3,600. And that's a lot to lose for the transportation fund, but it's just, I have a hard time thinking $40 a day, 7 days a week.
6.
You would be 6 days a week with how
6
you
days a
calculate it? Or, no, I think they calculated 7 days a week.
7 days
When
we would
you're
do.
making it permanent, even though there's not paid parking.
We can take care of that at
Yeah.
this table. We don't need to do 7 days a week. We don't charge for parking on Sundays. So if we want to do $40 a day times 6 days a week for this usage, we can do that.
Okay, well, I won't argue with you guys if there seems to be an agreement around $40. And I would agree with the 1 space.
Yeah, just toss this out, the bicycle rentals are a cash cow. You make a lot more money off of one rental bike
One
than
rental
selling,
bike, yeah,
than
per day,
selling
yeah.
a bike.
All right. So I'd like to make a suggestion, $40 a day, 6 days a week.
Sure.
And one space available.
Okay.
Do you have people who've asked for 2 already?
Well, it becomes, if it's head-in parking, that becomes a little,
Harder?
yeah,
The 3 that we're talking about currently are all parallel.
okay.
They're all adjacent to parallel parking.
And then the other thing is with Basalt Bike and Ski in particular, that one parking space may infringe, if we're looking at, 22 feet for a parking space, that might not, it might be, you might have barriers in front of other businesses, so we might have to adjust,
It down a
it,
little.
depending on, what it looks like with the adjacent businesses, that length.
So if it's a less than a full parking space, we would prorate the $40 down a little bit for that space? I mean, is that what you're asking?
No. You know what? Those businesses are already in conversations because they've already got some overlap that's going on.
Okay.
So I think this is going to be more of a welcome relief than a bone of contention. I think this is going to actually help.
And that's fine. I don't want to set an expectation, oh, we get this one spot, and it's like, well, it's actually like, little smaller because of X, Y, Z, that kind of thing. Like,
I think we want to equip you to make the best decisions in that area. Yeah.
all right,
Just make it work.
Very good.
okay. Can I get, just to make sure that I'm totally clear, so $40 a day, charged at 6 days a week, and a maximum 1 spot per, but we're still gonna weigh out, make sure it's safe as far as, the barricades and things like that. All right. All right,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.
What if all barricades had to be designed with bears on them?
A bear.
That'd be great.
Okay, guys, that brings us down to council board reports, some council updates and other discussion items tonight. Let's start with board reports. Anybody want to kick off? Any in-depth that you want to share with us?
I'll just share with you the progress that we're making at CORE for executive director. We have a selection committee that screens, and we've screened down to 2 finalists, and we're going to have in-depth interviews with the entire core board, the 20th, I think, in the Pearl Pass room, and some other interested parties, where we'll have an opportunity to meet the 2 finalists and get a feel for what the final decision is going to be. And that's the most activity you've really seen, the most important activity on a board.
Well, 2 things. At the APSHA meeting last week, and I'll team tag this with Skippy because he's very involved with the housing, there was a request by staff to go down to 1 meeting a month for the balance of the summer. And that's because there's some people who are on leave, and there's some short staff, and there's a kind of a growing sense, which I think is accurate, that we're having our staff spend so much time preparing packets for the next meeting every 2 weeks that they're not really necessarily able to dig in on all the bigger policy issues and things that they'd like to bring us. And so they'd like to make us more powerful meetings, again, until we're more fully staffed up, by meeting just once a month during this time period. And the board agreed on that. And then we did pass on 2 policy changes, which I'll let Skippy elaborate on right now.
Great. So the first one was just raising the income cap for individuals who are already renting. So this is not new applicants, but inflation being what it is and people getting raises, which is great, you can be up to 150% of your category without getting bounced out rather than 120. And that'll give us some time to kind of work through those changes. And then we just adopted a revised fee schedule. It didn't change any of the fees. It just sort of simplified the language to make it, I guess, more digestible for the reader.
Very good. And so it was a little bit of a short meeting. The two things that, will become further discussions for us at the appropriate time. One is the concept of whether or not to prioritize the Burlingame for sale units going forward. There's certainly a plea from Kelly at the county that they're trying, but they're really not going to have any sort of funding ballot question this year or any sort of anticipated funding anytime soon. So we will be able to discuss the pros and cons of that later. But the other item was asking Skippy and I to come back and get a kind of a full board opinion is on what is known as in-complex priority. And if you were to buy a studio at Centennial, when a one-bedroom came up, you would have an in-complex priority to address your occupancy of moving from that studio up to a one-bedroom. Or if you were in a one-bedroom with your partner and you have a child, you would have in-complex priority to move up to a two-bedroom because you have the occupancy issue. Over time, a few add-ons to that have been made. One is that, no, you cannot use in-complex priority within a single-family home neighborhood. And so people have occasionally wanted to move to the less expensive house that was in the neighborhood or things like that, but it's not readdressing occupancy. And then at Burlingame, there is no in-complex priority between the multiple complexes. So anyone living in the first complex, first phase, won't have an in-complex priority to bid on a new unit in Burlingame 3 unless they are addressing occupancy, because they've either, no, actually they don't even have that there. They just no in-complex between the three different phases. And so the staff had recommended to the board that we should not allow in-complex priority for folks who would like to move, but basically unit to unit without an occupancy need. So you're already in a two-bedroom, but I like that two-bedroom better. It has a better view. I like that two-bedroom better. It's in better shape. Whatever reasons that person may have. And so the board is relatively split on that. And we sent our staff back to maybe see a little more research of how often has this come into play. And the one side of the logic is that, well, that person who has one person per bedroom going into another two-bedroom, they're in complex and they wanted that unit, and eventually their unit will go on the market, so it's all okay. It just matters, it will be a turnover eventually. And so that makes it okay. On the other hand, the person who's already had a unit has had a chance to develop some equity. They've had housing and stability of cost. They haven't had to move every 6 or 8 months. And they can still bid for that unit. They just wouldn't have priority over other bidders. So you could have people out who have lost multiple lotteries or maybe bidding for their first time, who knows, but they are in an unstable housing situation for the most part. And they are renting, and they may literally be priced out of our own rentals because their income's gone up too much, or their landlord's no longer renting. And so for me, it's a difference between aesthetics of I'd like a better window, and I'm already in, and so I get priority to get that, versus people who aren't in yet, who haven't had that stability, and are doing it to address occupancy, not an aesthetic quality. And so that there might be other ways to summarize the discussion, of people saying, well, I really hoped I'd get that unit, it's so much better. or it's in much better shape than mine, and mine's not in such good shape, you know? And so that's why staff was bringing it to us to say, hey, we think that this is not a good policy to allow in complex priority unless you are addressing occupancy, up or down. And so, again, our board was split, and we wanted a formal opinion coming back from council before Skippy or I voted.
I think that unless it's an occupancy change, that it shouldn't be allowed, the number of units.
Is this the appropriate time for
Well, you said
this-
open
this-
discussion.
this
Thanks.
input? Yeah, okay. I'm just checking.
Oh, yeah.
Just checking.
Well, I think specifically on what you want to do with Burlingame Phase 3, I think.
No, specifically about in-complex priority rule changes.
Should it be only
regulation.
for net bedroom gain or not?
Right, and it's debatable whether it's should be agendized as a topic, or I think you could talk about it.
I think it's open discussion, kind of thing.
John, did you want to weigh in?
I agree. I think it should just be for if you need more bedrooms or less. I agree with Rachel. I think it should be just to add a bedroom or based on occupancy.
Same opinion, different opinion? Talk through it more?
I'd be interested, you made a request to get some more information about how often you've seen.
Yeah, I
just
think we did. I don't know when we'll hear
parallel.
that back. You'd like to see that?
I'd want to just know that anecdotally, even like, what are you seeing from it? My initial reaction is kind of thinking about not affordable housing, but a more free world. If you were in complex and you were in a unit, let's say you got into a unit and you loved being there, but there was an opportunity to move, I don't know why I wouldn't support that. So my initial reaction is to say, yeah, if somebody was in complex and was like, oh, this opened up in my complex and I wanted to change from ground floor to top floor, stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, the real difference is just, should they have priority over everyone else who would want to get in that lottery?
And
And are we saying that once you've already won, you keep getting priority to get the best of the best within the building? Or, and whoever is going to go in the lottery is going to get the unit you didn't like that you left behind? And-
Yeah.
I mean, that's where it's, because they can bid on it. It's not forbidding anyone from bidding. It's just, do you give them the bonus points that they're going to win that unit no matter what, pretty much? They might have to compete with other people in their own building, but they are not competing with all the people who have lost lotteries before. You know, that's the thing, you know. And again, one unit would eventually come up, but there may be significant time period of rehabbing or listing and closing those that continue on.
Yeah, I guess then I'd want to, if there was more information, that would help me, because I don't have any.
We can see if Brittany has come up with anything yet, Bethany, excuse me, and
I'm kind of in the middle. I trust your leadership and reasoning and the service that you do on the board. That's the reason I support you guys there, is because you extrapolate this stuff out a little bit more and think about, for me, I'm not as hard and fast as John and Ward just said it. I'm like, I don't really.
We'll bring back majority support for this, but still some questions, and when additional information comes back, we'll make sure that you get it. The only thing that I think Rachel articulated both sides well of the argument. I think they all have merit. The only thing that I didn't hear, which was meaningful for me in coming to this decision, is that, true or not, the perception that is engendered by universal in-complex bid is that the system is unfair or rigged in some way, tilted towards those already in it. Whereas if you have equity of opportunity in or out, it starts to defuse some of those public perception problems, which are real problems for the fundamental trust in the system. And for me, that's an important consideration.
So when I think about that, I think about the unit that the person would be moving out of to move into the in-complex unit that they would prefer for whatever reason it was. And it could even be as simple as access. Maybe it's somebody who's like, you know what, I'm on the 3rd floor and I just can't do 3rd floor anymore, and this unit opened up.
You know, I think it said unless you're addressing
Yeah,
access
ADA is a
because of
thing.
ADA issues.
ADA or
Okay,
So
but
you'd still have that
But
priority
it might
there,
not
but-
rise to the level of ADA, it could just be convenience or preference. The unit that they're leaving is still going to be opened up to the lottery, so again, I
Yeah.
don't need
No,
to
that's-
direct
I was
traffic on
hoping-
this, you guys.
I was hoping Allison was going to stay, because she'd be making that exact argument right now, and there's other on the board that agree with you, and
So you
it's
guys-
true.
And I think we want it to be clear, the difference between moving to a studio to a one-bedroom is addressing occupancy. It's not as if you have to move from a studio to a two-bedroom to be addressing occupancy, or a studio to a, you know, whatever. But, you know, to have a real bedroom as opposed to a studio, we consider that addressing occupancy.
Yep.
So that would give you priority. That's the whole reason people even buy Centennial Studios, is so they will have in-complex priority to move up to a one-bedroom when one opens up. That's my impression.
Well, hopefully that's enough support
Yeah,
from
I
those
think that's
guys.
clear.
and-
I think that's clear.
The only other two things, I think we had a brief debrief on board reports from John at the CML meeting in Glenwood Springs last week. I did not attend because I was still in quarantine.
Oh, just, I had,
One more?
from the option meeting?
Yeah,
if you're-
please,
Before we
go
move on. Just a couple other kind of liner notes, but I think that they're cool and worthwhile. APSHA hosted its first Facebook Live completely in Spanish this year, or not this year, in the last, since our last meeting, that had both a staffer and our new executive director, which I just think is a really great thing and something we have been trying to do. We are also going to be hosting at the Aspen Country Inn, or maybe it even happened by this point, some meet and greets to explore issues with residents and senior residents as well, which is something we talked about engaging more fully, which I think is really great. And we did talk about, we don't have specifics yet, of creating more opportunity for direct citizen board member interaction in lieu of those every other meetings that are dropped, to start just building relationship and trust. So I just thought those were really important things just to pass along to you guys. And we did have one public commenter, and I mentioned it just because we're getting more and more of these from Aspen Automotive, just talking about how difficult it is to find employees, and should we start having a conversation or thinking about, you know, what type of workers are truly essential for a community to function beyond what we already identify as, you know, police officers, et cetera. So that's all.
Artists.
Yeah.
Artists,
Yeah,
disagree with that.
it was very interesting. Just as a side note, I had to mention to the Housing Board, and it was a very respectful, very, you know, I take that comment to heart, that you can't bring in people from out of state who are skilled mechanics and then get into the system per se. But that Pico Off-Road with John Gunther had come into the Board of County Commissioners when I was there, and ski company had bought his building, so he was going to be losing his old location. And he found a lot that John McBride still had for sale, and he could build a brand-new facility that'd be environmentally sound and so much cleaner than the old one and everything like that. But he couldn't do it unless the county was going to waive affordable housing, because it would be too expensive. And we couldn't lose the only automotive repair shop that we had. And I asked them to look it back up. I couldn't remember if there was an audit after 5 years or not. But John retired, he sold the business, and now the new owner comes in. And at the time, John's like, we're fully employed, all my employees have housing, they all live somewhere in the valley, it's all good. But now the new owner's coming in to say, I don't have employees, I don't have housing, help me out, let me get to the top of the line. And that's kind of unfortunate.
Did Howard close down his space?
Somebody bought him out or something, is what he was saying, or it's been changed, the new limo company or something. He had said something about Howard being lost out there, but I don't know details. Okay, on to, from CML would be John. Session is over, thank heavens. Now we have to just let the attorneys find out what all the new laws are we have to follow and keep us in line, and things we can take advantage of. And then we'll all be at the CML meeting coming up in a couple weeks. But today was a conference call with Club 20 early in the morning for the executive board. We heard a very detailed report back from a consulting firm that has been working with them to increase their efficiency and their purpose and help define as an organization that's almost 60 years old, how do we go from being a mile wide and a couple inches deep to really focusing in and being a more effective voice of the Western Slope. So that was very good. And then we will, as a board, continue digesting that this Thursday and Friday in Grand Junction. Every 2 years, they have a new president, and they have a retreat, a leadership retreat to go with that. And so that's what I have set up for Thursday and Friday of this week. Thank you.
Thursday and Friday. I'll come to you in 1 second. My only board report is that we have our rafter retreat this Thursday, so we will be in
Thursday.
it'll be sharing your fun
Yeah.
in a different place. John, board reports or updates?
I gave all my board reports last week. I could update you on what's happened with the Nordic Council, though. Craig Ward came back with his report on the feasibility of creating
Snowmaking?
a snowmaking for Nordic skiing because of climate change. And our options are develop a snowmaking system on both the golf course and the school area, or just at the golf course, just at the school area, or don't do anything. Those are our 4 options, and that's where we are right now. So that's it as far as board reports. Are we done with board reports?
I got one more.
Okay.
Hey, can I ask you one question on the snowmaking? Is it just areas that always become bare spots? They're talking about having 1 or 2 guns on, or they feel like they need to do the full track?
The high school, but the more playing fields, they want to do a track there just because it's by the high school.
It's flat track.
And the golf course, yes, the issue is it melts out early. And they're actually we also talked about possibly working with John Wilcox up at Ashcroft. And I pointed out if we do that, we're going to have a shuttle service.
Oh, yeah.
And we're going to need drivers to drive the shuttle. And we're going to need housing for the driver.
John,
Oh, little waterfall.
as I recall from my days on the Nordic Council, that there is an advantage at the school because they can have sanctioned races
That's
at
homologated.
the school.
Exactly.
That'd be nice.
Skippy, another board report?
Yeah, Northwest COG. This may be our last all digital, talking about the next one being in person or hybrid. We spent the majority of the meeting talking about the annual budget report, both our budget, but then we had, gosh, I forget his name, but a gentleman in who has done work for the governor's office and for the state on sort of modernizing the budgetary process and moving kind of down that over a number of years from sort of line item to targeted to values-based to outcome-based budgeting. And that's both the exercise in how we visualize, conceptualize, and understand the budget so that we make different decisions, but also how we allocate funds and what we expect to see in return of those funds. I thought it was really interesting. He provided a whole deck that was very, very long. But I think it's interesting for us to look at, and I don't remember if I shared it with all of us yet. I know I think I shared it with all of us. Okay. I know I shared it with Tori first because some of the things were in line with some of the conversations we've had around continued improvement. So that I found really, really interesting. We talked about the climate summit, basically Mountain Towns 2030 in Breckenridge, and Northwest COG is going to be a $3,000 sponsor of that event, which is cool, and that was sort of a majority decision there, and we're encouraging people to go. And then in an update on the Vintage program, which it handles sort of issues of aging, senior issues, there are 5 new service providers in that network now, so it's growing, which is cool with the kind of renewed vigor around that program.
And when is the Mountain 2030?
It's coming up.
September.
Yeah, this fall. I don't know the exact dates. I can, if you remind me, I can forward you emails. I'm on their list, I think.
Okay.
I do have the date, and actually Shannon has booked, I think it came out today, and Shannon went ahead and booked a set of hotel rooms, and she'll be contacting you about your interest in attending.
Tell them we'll pay the STR tax for their housing if we do.
It is September 20th through 22nd in Breckenridge.
September 20th, I think?
20th through the 22nd.
That is it.
Thank you. John?
Is this my opportunity?
I think so.
Okay, I wanted to bring this up to the rest of you. I know Tori and I have talked about this a bit, but these outdoor propane heaters, they've always been a pet peeve of mine. In the winter, I kind of just accept them, but this time of year, I don't see the purpose. I was walking home last week from our meeting, and I walked by a restaurant open for Memorial Day weekend, and they had 2 flaming propane heaters set up on either side of their front door. And the host was standing right there as I walked by, and I said, "These heaters aren't heating anybody." And he said, "Oh, we just have them here to say that we're open." And I said, "Well, don't your open doors and people dining out here on the sidewalk tell people that you're open?" And he looked at me, and I think he was trying to come up with something to say, and I just walked away.
Yeah.
But it's against our environmental proclamation that was made here 20 years ago. It's against the Canary Initiative. It's everything that we don't stand for, and I'd like to.
John, I totally agree with you. When we've had special use permits that have been given out, I really want to get people to go to, I think there's radiant and there's some electrified heating that can be used that's more environmentally friendly. I want to phase out those propane heaters entirely in the winter and in the summer. And the idea that you have 2 of them burning to tell people that you're open.
And furthermore, as I was leaving there, the alley behind this particular restaurant, there was a guy loading a pickup truck with wood beds on the side, and it was full, and he wasn't being careful loading these things either, full
were
of
empty,
empty propane canisters, overflowing.
So John made this comment to me, and I said, well, Ward's talked about this before. You might want to bring it up at council table. There's different ways to skin this cat. For example, John's example of saying they were utilizing them for decorative purposes, if you will. They weren't warming anybody, right? Yeah. There's time of year restrictions that you could. There's a lot of different ways that we could try to start to regulate this if we think it's something that's detrimental for our community. So right now, we can't do anything right now and such. We would just kind of look over here and say, hey, we know that we're bogged with moratorium right now. We don't need a ComDev to be doing anything about this right now. But it does sound like there are council members that would love some information on this, some options, opportunities, et cetera. So can we just put that in front of you, Diane, and say,
Get it in the queue.
you know what I mean?
That's good enough for me.
Yeah, and I can ask environmental health to start on the research end.
That'd be
Thank you.
great. Is that okay, Jim? All right, thank you so much.
Excellent.
Thank you, John.
Thanks.
Okay.
The only thing I have to say about that is that if a change was going to be made for the upcoming winter season, you'd really want to have enough time for those businesses to have thought about and installed a different system, if that's where they're
Right.
going to go. So
Well, blankets.
that's all. It's,
Yeah, Butler
Jackets?
Rental too.
Jackets?
Bring a blanket.
But Butler Rental brings in these big things, so
yeah.
it's like,
Well, that's the thing, Tory did it really well he just said it, it's got a lot of code implications for special events, not just regular businesses, one-time offs, things like that, and so it will take some real looking into.
And yeah, again, I'm glad we're bringing it up now because we do have time before next winter starts. We do have staff working their tails off on a lot of other things, but
Let's get it going.
yeah, let's put it in the queue.
Okay.
Good.
I have just one last update, I hope, and then we can get out of here. I just wanted to talk to this council about Next Gen. Next Gen has, I believe, 4 seated members at this time. And I don't know if many of you saw, there was an article in the Times that was about Next Gen. And we were kind of hoping that through that article, we were going to get a bunch of applicants. Maybe people were going to be more aware that the board needs more applicants. At this time, we do have 2 applicants that have come forward. So This board is supposed to run as a full board at 7 members, I believe, 7 members plus 2 alternates, maybe 1 alternate. So we do have 2 people that are interested in interviewing for this board. We've all had this conversation going for about 6 months about the future of this board, its success, how it's going to be effective, and things like that. So I just want to bring it up at this time. We keep saying one more round of interviews and one more round of interviews. Is this council still supportive of one more round of interviews, or are we looking for some other return on the next gen board? And I just want to bring it up at this time because we do have 2 more. We have 2 candidates that are interested in interviewing. So
Let's get them running.
Yeah, I would say let's just tag it on to any of our upcoming work sessions that we can to do the 2 interviews and let them roll. You know, I think it, especially for the people who have recently been appointed, who've made an application, and, you know, maybe there's a bylaws change to say the board is 5 people and 3 is a quorum, you know, or something like that. A 7-person board is very hard to make a quorum on a regular basis.
And
I mean,
this is-
I know it was about having as many people in the room as possible, but we have not as many people.
Most
in-
7-person boards have a 4-person quorum, not a 5, so, but
Yeah.
we've been waiting to change that until we have these members, so let's just do it.
Okay, well, I don't know that they have to change the bylaws. We change the bylaws for them.
There is legislation that council adopted when it created it, and it would have to change that quorum number, because I believe it does address quorum.
Yeah,
So
and
that
no,
would
I
be
agree with
council.
that. I'm just saying, but we do it, not the Next Gen board.
No, I'm agreeing with you.
and the bylaws indeed actually need a couple of different changes, not just that one. Ward, do you have any input here?
Yeah, when was the last time there was a quorum and there was a next-gen meeting? It's been 2 years?
2 different things. We actually had a next gen meeting without a quorum in place 2 months ago. 2 months ago,
When was the last time there was a quorum?
maybe a year or so ago.
And we've appointed people to the board, and then they're gone, whether, for whatever number of reasons, they're gone. So I think that when there was strong leadership, there was a purpose and there was an interest. If we can get a strong interest, strong leadership, and it's understood it's strictly an advisory board, I would support it. But if we go through another round of interviews and still can't get a quorum, I'd say we pull the plug on it.
Thanks, Ward.
I'll agree with Ward's assessment. I think now that there are applicants interested, we should give them the opportunity. But I will reach a breaking point on this.
All right. Thanks, you guys. Just need to bring that back up.
Thanks.
Unless there's any other items for tonight, let's call it. All right, everybody, enjoy the rest of the meetings you have this week.
And tonight.
And to Skippy, safe travels.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bon voyage.
Gracias.
Do you know who's the?
Thank you. Thanks, Amy.
Tori, do you know who the mayor of?
The most
Charlotte
important
is?
French phrase I learned while
The
I was
current
over there.
mayor.
It's not the
I was single at the time.
Skippy, do you know the current mayor's?
First name starts with an M.